So we've already learned that you can't tell the quality of water just by looking at it. Most of the things, almost all the things that are dangerous are too small to see. And so you're going to have to use some other kind of equipment. We also learned to ask the question, for whom is this water clean for? For the environment or for humans? Those are two very different questions. So you're going to definitely want to take these down as notes, or you can just listen to this and take notes from the book. Either way you want to do it. But what we're talking about today is watersheds. This is an incredibly important term, and hopefully the activity that we did on Thursday or Friday really kind of helped you figure out what a watershed was. But what we're looking at right here is a river or river system that drains a specific area. So a watershed is not a river. A watershed is a land. Every piece of land is part of a watershed. So the Cape Fear watershed is that area that will, when it rains, will flow into the Cape Fear River. So therefore, right, a river is influenced by everything that happens in its watershed, because water, by carrying in runoff, will carry lots of things, anything that's on the ground, into a river. So one way to check, so when we check the water quality of a river, we're checking the river, yes, but we're also checking the land use that is in that watershed. And some watersheds are very large. I mean, this is the Mississippi River watershed. And think of all the things that we do in that watershed. It's like a third of the country. All of that water, whole states of water. I mean, look at that. How many complete states drain into the Mississippi River? So we have cities, we have farms with growing corn and wheat, and we have homes and factories, and they all drain into the Mississippi River. So this presentation is called Land Use and Water Quality, because what we do to the land directly impacts the quality of our water and river systems. So let's think about that. Let's think about some of the most important qualities of water. So what can't we live without for more than 3 weeks? What about 3 days? What can't we live without for even 3 minutes? So for 3 weeks, you might have guessed food. You can usually live without, you can fast for about 3 weeks before you get into trouble. 3 days, you really need water. Otherwise, you're going to die of thirst. But what can't we live without for more than 3 minutes is oxygen. Oxygen is incredibly important. So why is oxygen so important to test in aquatic systems? It's going to be the number one thing to test for. And in fact, all the other tests we do really are important because they affect oxygen, most of them. So let's think about oxygen. How much oxygen is there up in the atmosphere? Make a guess. How much oxygen is in the atmosphere by percent or by parts? You might know this. It's about 1 to 5, or about 21% oxygen. So the air, there's a lot of oxygen in the air. Some people say that we need trees because trees provide us oxygen, and I don't buy that as an answer, because if every tree and every plant on the planet was destroyed, we would have enough oxygen, I think, for thousands or maybe millions of years. It took literally billions of years to get all that oxygen in the atmosphere. It's not going to go away for any time soon. That's not why trees are important. Trees are important because they sequester carbon. So always put that in your answer when you talk about trees. But so there's a lot of oxygen in the air. But how much oxygen is there in rivers and lakes? So I want you to give me a guess by percent or by parts. How much in rivers and lakes? So you might have underestimated this or overestimated. It's 1 part in a million, about 1 part in a million, or 0.00001%. That is so little oxygen. So now we know, these fish, they have to have oxygen to live, just like we do. They may not need as much, but they need it. So if the oxygen level goes down in a river or lake, or in the ocean just a little bit, the fish are going to die. So that's why it's so important, because there's so little. It also tells you, I mean, you think about it. which has got to be a much more efficient organ, a gill or a lung? Obviously a gill, because they've got to somehow get that oxygen out of a substance that has almost no oxygen. And gills have this cross current counter flow. It's actually fascinating. You should study it, and maybe you did in biology. So let's talk about oxygen. You're going to definitely want to write these things down. Oxygen. There's a model of oxygen. It's O2, 2 oxygen atoms. So when we say oxygen, we usually mean O2. We don't usually mean just O, the atom, because that doesn't exist. It's too reactive. It's always mixed with something else. So it's the most important water quality parameter. It's the most important one. It's the one, like I said, all the other ones are important because they affect oxygen levels. And all organisms need it for respiration, right? So if you don't have oxygen, then there's just no respiration. Sure, there are anaerobic living things, and they live down in there in the lakes and streams, but they're way in the bottom under the mud. We need oxygen for almost everything that we can think of, except for some bacteria. So how does it get in the water? We need to know this too. How does oxygen get in the water? Any ideas? Give me an idea of how you think oxygen gets in the water. Write it down. So one of them is through photosynthesis. There are plants in the water. There could be algae in the water. We've talked about that. So photosynthesis by plants in the water will put oxygen in the water. Also, and this is a big one, just the movement of the water itself. When water moves over rocks and waterfalls, and it actually gets oxygen in the water. And then by simple diffusion. So it's just going to diffuse in, just like carbon dioxide diffuses in the water. So we got to measure oxygen. Obviously, since it's the most important parameter, we're going to have to measure it. And that's a colorimetric test. You put little chemicals in there and it just changes the color, and then you compare your standards to a set of standards. And the darker the blue, the more oxygen there is. So it measures the oxygen in parts per million. Parts per million. So I said that oxygen was in there about 1 parts per million. That's a little bit off. Fish need about 8 ppm to thrive. So that's a number you need to remember. Write it down. So if there's 8 parts per million of oxygen in the water, then that's golden. Fish are going to do great. More is even better. 10, 11 parts per million, that's just great. If it's under 4 is deadly. So if you're a fish and you got 3 ppm, you're not going to live very long. You're just going to suffocate. There's just not enough energy to thrive. You're not going to get enough energy to thrive because you needed oxygen for respiration. Between 4 and 8 is, okay, but not ideal. We want over 8 ppm. So the next thing we're going to want to measure is nitrogen. And you know why. Why do we want to measure nitrogen? Do we want nitrogen in the water at all? What do you think is what level of nitrogen do you think would be good to have in a lake or river? It should be 0. All right, it should be 0. It's a colorimetric test. We're going to do that again. It measures nitrates in ppm, but it should be 0 because, remember, nitrogen is a limiting factor naturally. And if there's extra nitrogen in the water, that's going to make an algal bloom. So if naturally any nitrogen goes in the water, it's just going to get sucked up by the organisms in there. So we don't want any excess nitrogen in the water. If we do, then there's something wrong. So what affects the nitrogen in the water? Right? What can have a big effect of nitrogen in the water? And I think you know that would be fertilizer and things like that, right? So we've talked about that already. Here's that Mississippi River. Think of all of the farming that's going on in there and all that nitrogen fertilizer that gets used. And we could do it more carefully, but nitrogen fertilizer is fairly inexpensive. And so a lot of that get washed into the river. And it's a major nutrient. It's the most important nutrient that we use because it's the limiting factor for plants, right? So we have all this nitrogen all over the place, and it's going to end up here. So on this colored photo, we have oxygen levels. So the red is very low oxygen levels, close to 0. and then it gets more and more, and blue is normal. So at certain times of year, at every major river that goes into the ocean, including the rivers that go into the Chesapeake Bay, you have these dead zones that happen, these eutrophic zones, and that is incredibly bad for the wildlife there. But think about the fishing industry and the shrimp industry that happens in these areas. So we studied this already, but I'm going to throw it up here again. Cultural, human-caused eutrophication has a few steps. So we should memorize these steps, and a lot of you have already. Think of it as a story. You add nitrogen to the land as fertilizer. The runoff carries nitrogen to the creek. Extra nitrogen causes algae to grow. The dead algae settles to the bottom. Bacteria decompose that dead algae. That requires oxygen. Oxygen levels go down. You create a dead zone, and you're not quite done yet. You got to go all the way. Anytime that you talk about a consequence, an environmental consequence, you should talk about killing something. I mean, take it all the way to low oxygen levels kill fish. Even when we talk about global warming, what are the consequences of global warming? Because by itself, global warming is not a consequence. And this is what I tell my classes always. You want to talk about an environmental consequence of carbon dioxide emissions? You can talk about global warming, but then you say, well, global warming will change habitats so quickly that organisms can't adapt fast enough and they will die. Or you could say something like rising sea levels will inundate coastal habitats and organisms will die. Or polar bears will die. I mean, take it all the way to something dies. Otherwise, it's an incomplete answer. And we got the algal bloom. We know that it's called algal blooms. So what are the sources? This is the last thing we want to talk about. The sources of excess nitrogen. All right. So we know from agriculture, this is good old tobacco, and fertilizers is the major source of excess nitrogen from agriculture. A major source. That's NO3 minus, right? But also animal waste, right? Animal waste from cows, and in North Carolina, especially pig farms, a lot of nitrogen in the waste. And so speaking of farms, we have that nice little pond right there. I wouldn't want to go swimming in that pond because that pond is what is called a manure pond or a manure lagoon. So a little story here, dairies and lots of animal farms are always located very near waterways, because then the pigs could just poop on the ground, and then the waste just goes right into the stream, and then the waste just takes it away. It's like nature's toilet. So dairies were always incredibly dirty operations right next to rivers. Then we kind of cleaned up our act. We had to move these away from the rivers. Although the farms were already there next to the rivers, we couldn't let that waste go into the rivers because we learned about eutrophication. So now what do they do with all that waste? They create these manure lagoons or these manure ponds. And the idea is that all the urine and fecal material go into those ponds and it eventually evaporates away. But just think of how flat North Carolina is. Think of what happens when that manure pond gets covered with 10 feet of flood water. All of that manure waste just goes into the water. So when you're in the flood water, you don't want to be in flood water in eastern North Carolina. So we also have residential uses. So in residence, if you ever seen people spreading these little granules over grass, that is fertilizer. And what kills me is that you see them spread this fertilizer, and a lot of it ends up going in the street and on the sidewalk, and especially when it's in the street and laying in the gutter of the street. When it rains, that's just a freeway to the creek. And so I personally think that fertilizing grass should be outlawed. There's other things you can do, like take out your grass and put something more interesting in. Another source of residential nitrogen is septic tanks. We're going to learn about septic tanks a little bit, but septic tank is if you're not hooked up to the sewage treatment plant because you're a little bit out of town. Everybody has a septic tank And since there's waste, we're going to see that when you get rid of waste, metabolize it, there's nitrogen left over. So that's going to leak. Commercial, the biggest commercial source of nitrogen is sewage treatment plants. We're going to learn about those this week. And we're going to see that one of the things that makes it all the way through the sewage treatment process is nitrogen. So there is nitrogen going back into our creeks. So sewage treatment.